Thanks, John. So my name's Amy Galford, and I'm one of the green belts in the Department of Environmental Conservation. This is a tool that I'm not going to claim to be an expert on, but I would say I'm an enthusiast of, and I think we could use it a lot more in state government. So you can go ahead to the next slide. It's called a RACI Matrix. You'll also see other variations of it. I like the one with the S in it, so you can still sort of say it RACI. But if you start searching online, you'll find all kinds of variations on this. And you know, if you get excited about this, you can look into one and find what works for you. The basic idea is that it's a matrix or a table of tasks versus roles. So what tasks are we doing and who's doing them? And then we try to figure out, well, beyond the person and the task, what's their role in the overall project? And we code those with terms like responsible for doing a task, accountable, supporting, consulted, or informed. And I'll talk more on the next slide about the definitions of those. The purpose of it is it's a tool to structure your thinking about what are the tasks in a work group. Hopefully you have some sense of that, but it makes you stop and think about those tasks. Who's doing each task? And in what way, and when and what level of information should they communicate with other people in their work group. And so it's a really simple tool, but it can trigger a lot of important conversations, I think. And going through the exercise of filling out one of these, we'll identify some uncertainties. You know, if you had everyone in your team fill it out separately, they would probably come up with slightly different versions. And when you talk about it as a group, you'll identify things that are maybe you already knew they weren't clear, and that's why you're doing the exercise. Or maybe it'll just identify some uncertainties when you go through it together. So it may suggest the need for other tools, including the one that John's going to talk about and some others that we'll cover this week. Next slide. So again, it's a really simple tool in terms of formatting. There are more complicated versions out there. People do fancy color coding and that sort of thing. But the basic idea is that it's a table. So you could do this in Excel, Word, PowerPoint, OneNote, on a piece of paper, on a whiteboard. It's a pretty simple tool in terms of setting it up. It's set up so that the rows are the tasks. Here they're written as function in the little screenshot I grabbed, but the tasks going as rows, and then the columns will be who's in your work group, and potentially people outside your work group, your immediate work group who you interact with. But let's start first about talking about how to define the tasks. The level of detail you're going to cram into this table depends on your work group and the purpose of why you're going through this. You want to be specific enough to differentiate who's doing what. But this is not trying to cram an entire process map or a standard operating procedure into this little table. So, you know, you might have a step like, for me, I get an application or I get a form, and maybe there's 5 tasks that I need to do because that came into me. But if it's all me doing them all at that one point in time, I don't need to go into a lot of specifics about that at this point. So you can lump kind of the small related tasks that are done by one person. If you were doing this not at the level of kind of a work group or a section, but something much broader in state government, then, you know, these might become very general. It's kind of, I think, not as much how the tool is used, but you could use this at a higher level, and then your tasks would also be more general. Now, this is showing a blank table. It's always hard to get a discussion going with something that's blank, but you already know amongst your work group some of what you're doing for tasks, hopefully, right? So you've got existing job descriptions, you have reporting requirements, things set in statute. You have maybe process maps you've already done, or skill matrix like John's going to talk about, SOPs. You already have a lot of information about the tasks that your group is doing. And, you know, just so that you're not meeting and spending a whole lot of time going through all the tasks, you could have your facilitator or team leader kind of cluster, order, or gather those tasks as a start. But then you do want to work on this as a group of people. It shouldn't be one person dictating what this looks like. It should be a discussion tool. Next slide. Okay, so more about those particular letters. And again, you'll see lots of different versions if you poke around online. A lot of them do not have the supporting. I happen to like it, but you may or may not need it. So just make sure that if you're going to use this tool, your work group understands the terms and definitions so that you don't use them inconsistently or keep revisiting the definitions. You kind of want to get a handle on those at the beginning before you start getting into detail. Responsible is the person who does the task, so it's probably in their job description. They know when it needs to be done and how it needs to be done. The person who's accountable for a task makes sure that that task gets done, whether it's by another person or themselves. And they may have some level of final approval. So this might be kind of a higher level of responsibility. Maybe they're not doing all of the task completion, but they're doing some level of, when there's an unusual case, something that needs to be elevated, something that's just needs a higher level of input and review, and just accountable that multiple people are getting parts of the tasks done.
Or a sign off.
Yeah, sign off is a good way to put it. So supporting is, some of these don't include it. It's just RACI, but include it if it's applicable and if it's important. If there's a unique IT step, for instance, or some kind of administrative task where they're not involved in the process in the same way as other members, but it's important that they do their piece of the puzzle. And then consulted would be someone who's involved in a two-way interaction. So you want their expertise, their input. What you're doing affects their work, for instance. And so it's early in the process, you're going to let them know what's going on, and there's going to be some back and forth. And then the role of being informed is just, you only need it if applicable. And that may happen when a task is starting or when it's being completed, and that's more of a one-way. So if they need to do a subsequent task, you make sure that they know what that is. You're not informing them just for the sake of informing. Usually it's somehow it affects their work. Go ahead to the next slide. So in those columns across the top, you can do them with specific people's names. You might do it more as, it's probably better as positions. It really should be about job descriptions and roles rather than individual people. In some cases, you might do them as groups of people. If there's something that gets assigned to a group and it's people with very similar jobs, and you may not need to break out in detail exactly who will get a particular task because it'll be somebody in that group. But generally, it's going to be individual people, but rather than sticking with the names, you probably want to stick with their jobs, titles. And then you're going to work through one task, one row at a time, and try to figure out those RASCI letters. So who is responsible? Generally, you want one responsible person per row. You might have cases where multiple people are responsible maybe on different days or for the northern part of the state or the southern part of the state or something like that. I would say if that's the case, you may just want to split it into separate rows and keep it clear. One person is responsible for this task. That's how things get done. And then accountable, absolutely you want one accountable person per row, because if multiple people are accountable for something, it turns into no one being accountable for it, or it ends up, just wasting time that multiple people are cross-checking each other. Often you will have responsible and accountable for the same person. It's two different levels kind of responsibility, but it may be the same person, just varies on depending on what your tasks and your work group look like. And then if you happen to have consulted or informed people, include them, and supporting also, that you don't have to. So don't feel like they need to be. You might have some separate kind of SOP or understanding of when you pull those people in to be consulted, or when you need to inform them, or when you need to get their support. Next slide. So I've got a screenshot over there of just a draft RACI matrix that I was making for my previous job. And I'll point out a couple things about it, but it's not completed there. So you'll see question marks on it. Again, the rows are the tasks, the columns are who's doing different things and their level of responsibility and whether they're involved with that task at all. The important thing is that this is a structure for discussing who's doing what. Just like any other lean tool we're going to talk about, if you come across wasteful tasks or steps, get rid of them. So that's not the purpose of this tool, but if you find them, get rid of them. If you're having trouble figuring out who's responsible and accountable, look at your task. Is it too vague? Is it too broad? Maybe you need to revise it. Maybe you need to split it up so that you can actually figure out, okay, this is actually a pretty complicated task. So it's really, in this case, we do need to break it down into smaller levels. And then you want to look for patterns. So, there was probably some reason you thought your work group needed to be going through this exercise. So, are there tasks where it's hard to agree on whose role? Is it hard to figure out who needs to be consulted? That's a valuable discussion point for your group to have. Depending on how you're setting this up, it might start you thinking about workload balance. There's other tools that look at that more. This particular one on the right was focused mainly on a program that I was running on. So I'm that person in column C there. So there's more detail there. And this is more about my job description. If you were scrolling down and you added things from other topics, other people would have more letters in their column, that sort of thing. But it might start to give you some hints about your workflow and your workload, just because it is a visual tool. What's going on with communication here? Do you have too many cooks? Do you have a whole bunch of people who all think they're responsible or accountable for something? Do you have people who are feeling left out where they say, hey, I should be consulted on this and I'm not, or I need to be informed on this? Like, where's your balance on that in terms of the number of people who are involved and how you're communicating with each other? And then think about how the informing part is happening. Does that need to be something active, like somebody gets sent or copied on an email? Or can you set up something that's an archive or a database or a visual management tool that they can go visit when they need that information? And so this is, you may be trying to make sure people aren't left out and so they stay informed, but, we all clutter each other's email too much because we're trying to inform people and not leave them out. But sometimes rather than just sending somebody an email in case they need a bit of information someday, is there somewhere they can get it when they need it down the line? So this is, it could also be a tool for orienting new employees and figuring out work coverage. Someone's out for a couple months for medical leave or something. Who's going to cover their work? Make sure that happens. Who's already familiar with it, with the general type of work, that sort of thing. And like any other tool, it's only useful if you're actually using it, if it gets revised over time, and where it's not obvious and hard to fill it out, that may lead to other tools or revising people's job descriptions. And for instance, I've got a few rows there with question marks on it because the reason I was doodling this out to share with some other staff was we had some new things we were doing and we had some stuff that fell into gray areas. And it was like, well, who is going to be responsible for this? Who is going to be accountable for this? And how do we fit this in? So, it can be a very simple table, but it can lead to some interesting conversations, I think. So that's what I had.
All right. Thanks, Amy. So we wanted to have a little bit of time for questions at the end of each of these. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and I'll call on you. Any questions about the RACI Matrix for Amy? Or the racing matrix, as the transcript calls it, which makes it sound really cool. Okay. Well, thanks, Amy. Oh, Eva, I see your hand is up. Go for it.
Not a question, more of a comment. I just appreciate the introduction of the S. I haven't seen that before, and this is a tool that we use a lot in our team. So that was an interesting ad, and I appreciate it.
Oh, and I did forget, I'll throw in the chat, there's one particular website that I found a useful introduction. So, if you're trying to orient new people to this tool, it might be helpful, and it talks about a couple variations on that. So I'll throw that in the chat.
All right. Thank you, Amy, for that.